This is TWiT.
The news is bad. The United States has continued to prosecute the Huawei vice president, who's currently in Canada but is being held for extradition for spying. There's a Polish Huawei executive who's been arrested in Poland for spying. Huawei, which is a Chinese maker of, it's the _2, although it goes back and forth with Apple. I think they're #3 this week, manufacturer of smartphones after Samsung. So it's Samsung, Apple, Huawei. Sometimes Apple is third, sometimes second. So they're this is a big Chinese company founded by a former member of the Chinese military. And the government, the U.S. government is saying, has already told 2 of the big U.S. carriers, I think Verizon and AT&T, they may not use Huawei gear in their 5G network. What this is, I find this fascinating. This is a very difficult challenge because no one else is making 5G gear as good as Huawei, as well as Huawei, as inexpensively as Huawei.
That's why we need that competition. But like, this cuts deep, right? This cuts back to the sort of like cyber Cold War we've been having with China and a lot of other countries for the past decade. You know, this goes way, way back. And I think the main worry now with Huawei is that, is this just another arm of the Chinese government trying to just have its tendrils there, maybe not actually doing anything, but having the capability to read data if they wanted to, or have a certain amount of knowledge around what's happening around the world. It's a legit fear.
I was skeptical. I wasn't clear because I like Huawei gear, to be honest.
It's nice. I have a Huawei laptop that I really
that Mate 20 is great.
Awesome.
The Mate Pro, I love their phones. So I thought maybe they're a victim in the U.S.-Chinese trade war, but now my mind has a little bit been changed. The U.S. unsealed the indictments against the Huawei chief financial officer is being held in Canada, Meng Wanzhou. And among the accusations, prosecutors say Huawei stole trade secrets, including technology behind a robotic device T-Mobile used to test smartphones, Tappy. Huawei engineers secretly took photos of the robot, measured it, and tried to steal a piece of it from the lab. Okay, well, maybe. There is no allegation in the unsealed documents that Huawei is working at the behest of the Chinese government.
Right. I mean, that's what's interesting is that this is slightly different than some of the ZTE scandals, you know, where there was, you know, ZTE, which is another Chinese manufacturer, and they're often conflated with Huawei because they make similar things and have had similar accusations against them.
The U.S. Department of Commerce banned both ZTE and Huawei. So.
Right, exactly. But in ZTE's case, I think there was actually some like direct allegations to saying that their network equipment was spying or could potentially be spying. Whereas this seems to be more about like, are they, you know, capturing secrets or this or that. What's actually interesting, and it hasn't had as much traction, but I work with a number of Canadians who used to work, worked in the Canadian telecom industry for a long time, and what's sort of kind of an interesting wrinkle to, you know, the whole fact that the arrest happened in Canada is that a lot of people from the Nortel days in Canada are angry about what they, you know, perceive of Huawei's role in the downturn of the fall of Nortel. So
interesting. Australia has banned Huawei gear from its 5G rollout. The Department of Defense bans both Huawei and ZTE from U.S. military bases. British Telecom says they're going to strip Huawei equipment from its 4G network by 2021 and won't use it in 5G core. But see, this is the issue. It's everywhere.
Right, exactly. It's like, well, who do you go to? I guess like you have Ericsson, but who else? And you have Intel maybe, but like who else do you have who even makes some of this stuff? I'm not as familiar. Vendor, do you know? Because I know
Nokia and Ericsson are two big providers. Of course, they're in Scandinavia, so maybe the Finns like us. I don't know.
And this year at CES, Intel was saying, we want to be everywhere. We want to be in all the pieces because they missed out on mobile completely, right? By not powering the iPhone. So I think right now Intel's like, we don't want that to happen ever again. So there's going to be a big push by Intel. Who knows how well that works out, but they've been pushing like modems. They've been doing LTE modems, and that's worked out well for them so far.
Qualcomm has reached a licensing agreement with Huawei a couple of days ago.
Interesting. Well, but I guess this is my question. Like, how much of this do we think is there any sort of like xenophobia involved in this?
Yeah, Tappy, taking pictures of Tappy, the T-Mobile robot, doesn't sound like cyber espionage.
But it was because they were talking about either purchasing it or licensing it, and it's that is what stealing is, right? Like they took that idea, they took photos, like they stole that tech.
Companies do that. I mean, okay, it's wrong. It's
wrong.
Illegal.
Yeah,
but it is not a national security threat, I mean, is it? I don't think it is.
Well, it's because it's a Chinese company doing that to a U.S. company, and I think there are a lot of reports about U.S. companies like visiting and trying to partner with some Chinese companies. All of a sudden, their tech. There were some really good. I think it was like All Things Considered had a good chat with some folks.
I listened to that. There's a guy who wrote a book about this, and it was interesting. Look, it's clear what the threats could be. If you have, if your network is built on your network infrastructure is built on gear from a company controlled by the government of China, and it doesn't even have to be currently controlled because it is a Chinese company. At some point, the government could say, "Okay, fine, thank you. We'll take over from here," or "We'd like access to that network." So that's legitimate. There's both industrial espionage threats and national security threats because. If we start to rely on 5G infrastructure, our entire autonomous fleet is using 5G to communicate, and all of a sudden the Chinese government flips a switch and it stops working, that's not good.
Sure.
That's cyber war.
It isn't. There's a lot of pressure on Canada to ban Huawei.
I think Canada has, haven't? Oh, they haven't yet. Okay.
They have not. There's a lot of pressure on them too. Because, again, there's a lot like the big five are kind of looking at us as well, because if our infrastructure has Huawei, like you go through us to be able to get information anyways. So that kind of compromises everyone else to be able to deal with it. But, Huawei's already said like they deny that they're spying for the Chinese government or that they are using their technology for spying in any way. They didn't say that they couldn't. Or that they wouldn't, which is like also they were not really strong in their statements to that. And in Canada, they're still looking into it, and they're going to make a decision dependent on what they find for security. Like we're lucky Trudeau actually has a good knowledge of technology and how it's used, and he did hire a whole bunch of people that work in the government that really are in the field, like the agriculture minister actually works in agriculture. So we're hoping that we'll actually get some good answers to that.
Nice humble brag, Georgia. Very nice.
Yes, seriously. So congratulations.
So great for you.
Officials actually know what they're doing. Congrats.
Yeah, show off. So the person that was on Fresh Air is named David Sanger. He's a security correspondent for the New York Times and has written a book about cyber warfare called The Perfect Weapon. So his point, which was kind of interesting, is that these switches that Huawei is selling are basically not hardware, they're software. So if in the old days when switches were hardware, a company could buy them and presumably inspect them in such a way to make sure that they were safe. But the problem is it's software. Not only is it software, it's software that's updated fairly regularly. So there's no way to be sure that that software at some point won't be modified in such a way that it could be dangerous. There's just no way to guarantee that.
How do you put any safeguards in place to be able to deal with that?
Right.
Yeah.
So it's not hardware. It's important to understand. It's not just that don't put that hardware in there. It's the software that's the real concern.
And I don't disagree with that. I mean, I think that's a valid concern. I guess the only thing I would push back on is you could make that claim about any provider, right?
Well, that's right.
Right.
I mean,
so a little bit of it is probably because it's China versus if the U.S. got caught doing exactly the same thing. They were a big enough company, they might get a pass on it.
Right.
Right, and which I guess is kind of my point, which is that I don't doubt that there are real concerns. I just wonder in some cases how much there is a xenophobic component and an anti-China component that may not be warranted, and that bothers me if I'm being totally like like that bothers me.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's where my unease comes from. Exactly, Christina. Is this a product of xenophobia and trade war, or is I mean, there certainly is legitimate root cause for concern. I don't know. Is Ericsson? I guess Ericsson, we can trust them because They're not from
Right,
China?
that's what I'm saying. Well, but right, see, that's the thing. It's like, are we putting the same scrutiny against Ericsson, against Nokia, and against others that we're doing here? I think we should, right? Like, I think that we should. But if we're not, then we need to discuss and have a real conversation about why. And when we're talking about holding people and arresting people in different countries and extraditing them, again, like you need to have, in my opinion, very, very good reasons for that.